afternoon and good evening to everyone. Welcome to today's webcast. My name is Shai Fuchsman, and I am with Education in Conflict and Crisis Network, or USAID ECCN, and I will be the moderator for today's webcast. The webcast is a collaboration between USAID ECCN and the Equity in Education Research Initiative. You will hear more about this initiative later in the webcast. As for USAID ECCN, we are a community of practice composed of USAID representatives, implementing partners, and others working to increase equitable access to education in areas of conflict and crisis. You can learn more about USAID ECCN and join our network by visiting us at eccnetwork.net. On our website, under Events, you will also find a web page that is dedicated to today's webcast, where you will find the bios for today's presenters, as well as related resources. Over the next coming days on the same page, we will also post the recording for today's webcast in case you want to listen to it again or share it with others. And hopefully, we also hope that on that same page, we will also continue the conversation that we begin today. Before I begin, I want to briefly go over today's format. The purpose of the webcast today is to present a research study that was recently conducted by FHAI 360 on the link between conflict and education inequality. We have broken down this presentation to two parts. The first part will focus on the background, conceptual framework, data, and methods of the study. And the second part will focus on the results and discussion. After each part, we will have 10 minutes for questions and answers. As Amy said before, all of your lines are muted except for our speakers. If you want to ask a question, please type it at any time during the presentation in the chat box on the right of your screen. During the Q&A session, I will read these questions, or as many questions as time permits, and I'll let our presenters address them. At the end of the presentation, my colleague Annie Smiley will also briefly tell you about the Equity in Education Research Initiative, including the Conflict and Fragility Working Group, which focuses on the theme of today's presentation. And she'll also tell you about how you can get involved in this initiative. So without further ado, I want to present today's speakers, Karina Omovea and Wael Musa, both from FHAI 360.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I'm still, kind of playing with the technology. I think you can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. For those of you who are in this time zone, or good afternoon, good evening. So happy to be able to present this today with my colleague, Wael Musa. We're presenting a study that some of you may have heard about before. I see a lot of familiar names. It's really exciting that you guys made time for this. And I really hope for a really great discussion and conversation later about the study, as well as about the Education Equity Research Initiative. And it's interesting how we connect the two pieces together, the piece of the study itself, which is really kind of hardcore quantitative study, and we did make time to talk about the methodology and the data, but also kind of make this an opportunity to segue, talk about the initiative as a whole. And the reason is that the study for us provided the impetus for looking at equity more deeply. So in developing the study, in constructing this time series data set that we're going to talk about later today, we realized how really scarce the data is on education inequality, and how little do we know, and how limited the data is for going anywhere beyond gender disaggregation, really, and looking at equity in education, and so how limited the measures are themselves. So we're looking at educational attainment for the simple reason that that's the biggest, that's the variable the most available to us to present the stock of education. But there's so many things that we just aren't able to look at, and really provides, the rationale for having a more concerted effort and strengthening our data system, strengthening our monitoring, taking a closer look at how we evaluate our programs, and that's all kind of, what really drives the Education Equity Research Initiative that we'll talk about later. So just to kind of go back and then just, jump into the study itself. This is a research project. We're talking about the particular study that we completed recently, but it's part of a larger research project that we worked with UNICEF, Learning for Peace Initiative, Peace Building Education and Advocacy Program. And it spans, I think, more or less 2 years, maybe, just over 2 years. The interest for UNICEF and for the initiative was really to say, is there a linkage between education inequality on the one hand and violent conflict? So that's one research question, and then the other research question was whether is there a link between, what is the impact of violent conflict then on education equity? So, the study, the multiple papers that are now available from the entire project. There are 2 literature reviews that cover much of the literature on the subject on education inequality, on conflict and linkages between education and conflict overall. And there's these 2 quantitative studies that you can look at in depth. So today we're focusing on conflict and inequality. So given levels of inequality, starting levels of inequality and taking conflict as a sort of external shock, what happens with education equity down the line. So I think I can advance this slide deck here. Okay, the research question specifically for the study, for this study, so this is what we call part 2, is that does violent conflict affect education? And that seems to be a fairly straightforward question. I think a lot of you would say that, yes, it does. And it seems that it's unambiguous, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of the effect on the education system. However, if you think about education inequality, that it becomes a little bit more tricky to disentangle. So that's where we come in, and we want to say, is there empirical evidence between the effect of conflict on the balance of education opportunity and consequently on education inequality? So does the nature of the, those are sort of secondary questions. Does the nature of the conflict matter? Does the duration of the conflict matter? And does the country's levels of fragility matter? And I think a lot of you would know a lot about, what constitutes fragility and the difficulty of disentangling the risk of conflict per se and the conflict event from fragility as a condition. So that's what we're, the complexity of the project comes in. So just very quickly, we have a very straightforward framework for the analysis, as we said, and yes, if it is ambiguous, why is it ambiguous? Well, because there could be different ways and pathways in which the conflict may affect education inequality. So in the situation here, we can say, yes, it exacerbates inequality because there are winners and losers. And after conflict, you can see a growing disparity. Therefore, the magnitude of inequality between group A, group B in this case, or individual A, individual B would be greater. In a different scenario, though, let me see if I can. So in a different scenario, you can imagine a scenario where conflict would resolve inequality, and in fact, there are cases in history that we know about that were driven in part by inequality in education access or in educational outcomes, and that as a result, if the conflict was resolved to the benefit of the grieving side, you can see that there's some improvement in the level of inequality. So that would be a scenario that we can also consider plausible, and that sort of models our argument a little bit like thinking about, it's not that straightforward. So our job is to see what is the pattern, what does the data say across the board. So in summary, so it's resolving or exacerbating, and then if it's exacerbating, then we're talking about potentially a vicious cycle where we have education inequality, violent conflict, and then violent conflict then feeding back into inequality. As you'll see, I think if some of you have time to browse some of the literature reviews that we've done, we have really covered extensively the literature on the subject, and it's very sparse on the second relationship of conflict and inequality. There's a lot of case studies, as I mentioned, a couple of case studies that were looked at that, actually where inequality was resolved through partially through conflict. But then quantitative analysis are always correlational, and it's difficult to say one way or the other. So it's, and that's why it's nice to have the opportunity to make a contribution to this literature. So in short, and we'll go over more of the findings, in the course of this presentation, but generally what we find in the study is that ethnic conflict exacerbates inequality. Ethnic conflict specifically, when I talked about nature of conflict, we talked about ethnic and non-ethnic. So we find that it's particularly true for wealth inequality, inequality between socioeconomic groups, and we break it along the wealth index and a lot of the wealth, a form of wealth index for, I think, for most of our data sources. And it also exacerbates gender inequality, so it's to the detriment of female, of women. Minor conflicts, and we call them minor because that's and we'll talk about the definition of conflicts, but they're much more extensive, much more frequent, and they have more prominent effects of inequality because they're more protracted. Inequality worsens and protracted conflict the longer it is, and that's very intuitive. The longer it is, the more exponentially you see increasing the magnitude of the effect, of detrimental effect on inequality. In high fragility countries that start with a really, in a really high fragile environment where conflict is likely to begin with, when it actually does happen, it exacerbates inequality further. And then you'll see later some of the trends that Wael will talk about, where we see a modeling of the level of inequality, reaching a peak level during conflict, but then after it ends, doesn't quite go back to pre-conflict levels. So I think one of the biggest contributions that we have made, actually, as part of the study is to construct a data set that is now publicly available. We call it the Education Inequality and Conflict Data Set, the EIC data set. And we took all of the available data sources that we could find from 1960s. I think our earliest data sets are from before 1960 and all the way up to 2010, and that's actually where we had to cut it off. And it's household surveys, census data sets that provide us with data on educational attainment by years of schooling. This is how we define education in this case, and how we measure education inequality is years of schooling aggregated to a level of the group, or measured at the individual level for vertical level of inequality. That's that's sort of measured across all individuals. And we have also conflict data on incidence and onset, and this is from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and that's I think the primary data set for conflict research. And we use it for all of the studies as part of the research project on conflict incidence and onset. And we use onset in the previous study. We use incidence as ongoing conflict in this study, so that data is not ours. And then when we construct inequality data, we have constructed multiple measures, including the Gini coefficient, including SAIL index, which is an alternative measure of sort of composite measure of inequality. And there's various other measures that we've constructed that have been used in previous studies just to test our sensitivity of our results to our specification, but we primarily rely on the Gini coefficient as the more intuitive. And this kind of gives you, the slide also just talks about the primary dimensions in which we're able to explore inequality and the effect of conflict on it. So horizontal, when I say vertical and horizontal, we say, vertical inequality in literature is just across all individuals. It's like, your Gini coefficient on income is measured across individuals the same way we measure inequality across individuals in years of schooling. But horizontal, we have to first define the groups. And in this case, we define groups based on their ethnic characteristics, so it's ethnicity that's declared in the data source. Could be a marker, but could be a language marker, could be a religion marker as well. So we do both. We also have a gender disaggregation for all. So in fact, ethnicity and gender are cross disaggregated. And then we have a wealth in this latest study where we do a wealth decile, cutting the groups by wealth decile first using the created wealth index. And I mentioned that we're using the Gini coefficient, even though we do have other measures in our data set for people to browse and use. In terms of the descriptors, I think we wanted to give you a sense of what we're looking at in terms of what does the actual data look like. So this graph here shows you our data set and our trend, and here you have the orange curve. You see how the mean years of inequality, mean years of schooling increases, and that's because we see an expansion of education access across the board. And then you have the Gini coefficients are fairly flat, slightly going down. In some regions, actually more than the others. In sub-Saharan Africa, if we did the disaggregated graph, you see that there is a more, that inequality is going down, in fact. But overall, across the board, it stays a fairly flat line. Defining armed conflict, as I mentioned, it's Uppsala Conflict Data Program data. So we're using we're using their definitions, and it's at least 25 battle-related deaths in a calendar year. We have the low intensity, 25 to 1,000 deaths, and then high intensity, which is considered a war, and that's above 1,000 deaths a year. We'll look at duration, and while we'll talk about the effects of the duration on conflict, and that's years in conflict post-onset. And in terms of type and nature, we only focus on intrastate, so we're not going in interstate conflict or non-state. So in our case, where we define conflict when the state is party to the conflict, that's the only definition we use. And in terms of the ethnic, in terms of nature, we're using ethnic and non-ethnic as the binary. So the popular rebellion that some papers use is also kind of a take on the definition of a non-ethnic conflict. That's really arbitrary in this case. But so when it's defined as ethnic, we use that definition to disaggregate the effect. So before we kind of go into the methodology again, just to take a step back and think about what makes it difficult from the methodological standpoint, is that of course we know that conflict is not random. I mean, it's not something that could just happen out of nowhere. There's a lot of conditions, there's a lot of factors that make conflict more likely in some contexts and less likely in others. And so that makes it difficult to say, well, is it conflict that affected anything down the road, or is it the actual condition of the country itself or a given region? So conflicts are also rare, and that makes it also difficult. Statistically, you want to have some balance in terms of the distribution of events. And most countries have experienced some form of conflict, interstate conflict, since the end of the World War II. But in general, it's more rare, thankfully, than so that we have fewer countries in conflict than we have countries not in conflict. And then inequality itself is a predictor of conflict, and that I, as alluded to, we have did the previous study last year, where we found, this is from our study, this is the graph, it's a simulation actually based on our data, where we show that the group Gini is highly predictive of the likelihood of conflict, and particularly this is for ethnic, so that's actually post-2000 in the latest decade. We found that subnational, when we defined Gini and subnational inequality, was highly predictive across the board, but there we had fewer data points to work with. In general, so if inequality is predictive of conflict, then it's sort of like, well, how do you, is it previous inequality or is it conflict itself? That becomes difficult to identify. So with that, we have an identification strategy that we think is interesting and that we're really excited about to be able to try out and work with. And so I think with that, I will pass the floor to Wael, who will walk you through the methodology. Thank you.
Thanks, Karina. Hi, everyone. I'm Wael, and I'll be walking us through the identification strategy of this paper, which basically means how did we identify the effect of conflict while isolating it from all sorts of different confounders that we know will affect conflict and will also affect these educational outcomes that are of interest in this study. So, like we said, like the title of this presentation says, we're trying to form a quasi-experimental setting. So how do we do that? The important part here is how do we create apples-to-apples comparisons when we're talking about comparing countries who experienced conflicts and countries that did not. That sounds like a near impossible task. So for that purpose, what we do is we start by defining countries' levels of fragility. And by that, we mean fragility as the set of conditions that will affect both the level of or the probability that a country will experience conflict, but at the same time, the set of conditions that will also influence educational inequality. So we want to try and control for that level of fragility, so we can say country A and country B have the same level of fragility, but country A experienced conflict while country B did not. Now, what is the effect of conflict? So that's what we're going to try and do with the data set that we have with us. Okay, so given that we're trying to create an experimental setting, what we take advantage of what happened in history in the past 60 years is that the timing of the incidence of conflict has varied between countries. So not every country experienced conflict at the same time. So that gives us a little leeway in terms of when certain countries experience conflict, there's a host of other countries that did not at the same time, which gives us this natural control group in every time period. And so to do the best methodology for this is usually just using a simple difference in differences strategy, which means that we will compare the inequality between the pre and post conflict periods for those countries who experience conflict, and at the same time we will compare changes in inequality in the pre and post conflict periods for those countries that did not experience conflict. And so now we have basically a treatment group of country years and a control group of country years, that one that observed conflict and the other did not. And that's basically how we're trying to set up this simple experimental setting. And so in terms of going into the regression equation to sort of formalize the setting of the difference in differences, you'll see here we have y subscript CT, which means y is the outcome variable of interest or the dependent variable for a country C and time period T. And the outcomes of interest we look at in this study are mean years of schooling, the national Gini coefficient, the gender parity index, and we look at between ethnic and religious group Gini as well as between wealth group inequality. The next two elements of this equation are, you'll see here, gamma C and lambda T. Those will represent the country and year fixed effects. So basically, it allows us to identify the countries that at any point in time had experienced conflict and the countries that did not. And then the lambda T will represent every single time period in our data set to basically identify the pre-periods for every country and the post-periods for every country. In addition to that, one of the more important assumptions of the difference in differences is that the trends of these outcomes prior to the incidence of conflict or the onset of conflict have to be similar between treatment and control countries. So what we do is we include a quadratic function of peace years that are lagged by 5 years to control for that pre-treatment trend in the mean years of schooling or the inequality variables. Next, we include X, which is just a matrix of control variables, and these will represent the set of conditions that define fragility. So these include demographic variables, political climate, and economic activity. So these include things like GDP per capita, the percentage of the population that are between 15 and 24, level of democratization, etc. And finally, the most important variable in this equation is C with a subscript CP. That means this is a dummy variable or an indicator variable that takes on a value of 1 when a country is experiencing conflict in a certain time period and 0 otherwise. And so delta, which is, you'll see that is attached to the C variable, will be our treatment effect. And that's what we're trying to identify in this paper. So delta will tell us how much conflict affected these outcomes of interest while controlling for all of these other confounding factors that affect both conflict and mean years of schooling as well as inequality. And so for the difference in differences to be successful in identifying a causal effect, like I said, pre-treatment trends must be parallel, and we must have non-random selection. We want to try and mimic random selection into conflict, which we do not have. So right now what we have is non-random selection into the treatment group. And I'll talk about in a minute about how we actually try and circumvent this problem. So for common trends, we can test this empirically. We test it by the inclusion as well as exclusion of country-specific time trends in the difference in differences regressions, and we find that it actually does not change our estimates. So we're safe in that sense. So our one of the more important assumptions in our difference in differences strategy is actually working. Another test we run is a falsification or a placebo test, where we use pre-treatment data for our entire data set, so pre-conflict data, and then we randomly assign false conflict dates, and we see if that affects any of the results to see whether or not our estimates are actually spurious or not, and we find that they are not. Now, the second problem, which we're talking about, non-random selection, we circumvent this issue by employing a propensity score matching algorithm. And there's a lot of literature on how this is done, especially in a difference in differences setting. So what a propensity score matching does is, again, this brings us back to how do we create an apples-to-apples comparison and follow them across time. So the propensity score model that we use first estimates the probability that any given country year observation that it will be in conflict, given the set of fragility conditions that it has. And so the goal here is to account for factors that will both affect the likelihood of treatment and the actual outcome. And so for each treated observation, we do try and find a matched control observation, which means that if country A experienced conflict and it has a set of characteristics X, we will try and find another country that has a very similar set of characteristics X, but did not experience conflict. And that's how we're identifying this effect of conflict on inequality as well as years of schooling. So once the sample observations are balanced, so once we run the propensity score matching algorithm, we want to make sure that our treatment groups and our control groups are actually balanced, i.e. they are similar on key observable characteristics. And that way we're able to mimic something that looks like a randomized experiment. And so to visualize the identification strategy once more, you will notice at the very left end of this figure, you'll see that I have two rows where I have the first row is the treatment group and the bottom row is the control group. And so you'll notice that the first, the blue boxes will indicate a certain level of fragility that we need to match on. So we need to make sure that our treatment group and our control groups look similar. And then the difference in differences strategy kicks in right after that, where we observe both set of countries during no conflict periods, and then we observe the same set of countries when the first group experiences conflict. And then the differences, the change in education inequality for the first group relative to the change in inequality for the second group would actually be the treatment effect or the conflict effect in this case. And we would argue that that is a plausibly causal relationship. And so to show how similar or dissimilar these groups are at baseline, so you'll see here that I have three lines in the left graph. First line is the solid orange line, which is the conflict group, and this is the distribution of their likelihood of experiencing conflict given their characteristics. And the solid blue line is the probability that the country that did not experience conflict would experience conflict given its set of characteristics. And you'll see that they're very dissimilar. It's an almost bimodal distribution. So what we do is, after we run the matching algorithm, we basically filter through all of the country year observations that don't match, and you'll see that we are left with a very nice distribution of countries that actually mimic the conflict countries very well, and that would be the dashed blue line. And so from this graph, we can start to tell that our control group that we constructed seems like a feasible control group, and that it would do the job. In tabulation form here, I'll go through differences in the observed characteristics between the conflict countries and the no conflict countries, and you'll see on the left panel, under the column heading unmatched, you will see that the differences, they're all bold and stars, which means that the differences in characteristics between these two countries are actually large and statistically significant, which means that they're not really comparable. So if we only ran a naive OLS or a naive regression on this, we would definitely get biased results. So after the matching algorithm is run, you'll see that the differences are almost entirely insignificant or statistically insignificant, except for the very first one. But we'll argue that this difference is actually small in magnitude. So at the very least, we're able to mitigate as much as possible these systematic differences between the conflict and no conflict countries to create a plausible treatment and control group. And so I will pause it here before we start getting into the next round, which is we'll talk about the exact findings of this identification strategy that I just talked about.
Great, thanks, Wael and Karina. As Wael said, we'll pause here for a second and give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. If you have any questions, please type them in now in the text box on your right. And we'll start with the first question from Gwen Keener. Your data set covers 50 years of conflict. Does your methodology account for differences in time? In other words, how is this relationship between conflict and education inequality different in recent history compared to 50 years ago?
I think, so if you're trying to look at the relationship between conflict and education in, say, different decades, I think we covered that issue in the previous iteration of this. I think Karina can talk a little bit more about this, but essentially what we found was that I think in the first 4 decades of the data set, the relationship wasn't very strong, but in the most recent, in the 2000s, I think the effects were much bigger. But I think Karina could speak a little more to that.
Sorry, folks, if you're not on mute, then it'd be great if you could go on mute. We're getting a little background noise. So Karina wants to continue with the question or the answer.
Karina, you're there?
I think she's muted.
Hello?
Yeah, Karina?
Hello? Yeah, sorry. So I was just saying that, yeah, it's in the previous study we did find the effect of the decade, of the period. So I mentioned that we looked at each decade since the 1960s, and we cut decades different ways. And we found that the effect of inequality on conflict was the highest in the most recent 15 years, and since the year 2000 for ethnic inequality. But it was across, it actually didn't matter for subnational inequality, which is also a proxy of ethnic. For this one, Wael, we did, remember we did also cut the data by decade, and we did explore whether conflict in different time periods was affecting inequality differently, and we actually didn't find that there was, that there was, I think we found that it wasn't, the findings didn't differ by period.
Right, I think the magnitudes were the same across the different decades.
The magnitudes were the same. Our power was a little bit worse. I mean, if we started cutting the power meaning the number of observations we were working with, so that hindered our results. And we ultimately decided that it wasn't, as informative to present the results by decade.
Great. There's a follow-up question from Ali Krupar, which is, did you consider time of conflict, I'm assuming duration of conflict in the matching process?
Duration of conflict. Well, we disaggregated by, we looked at different types of conflict, and while we'll talk about it in terms of the duration, short-term conflicts, and then for each, we had actually cut, so I think it's under 5 years, and then 5 to 10, and then above. But so that's, we just disaggregated or sort of ran separate regressions with interaction effects for the duration. We didn't actually match because I think that would have made it difficult for us to create a data like enough observations.
Yeah,
with data
and I think in terms of the matching, so what went into the matching was, if I can scroll back to the slides real quick. So if you'll go back to the difference in differences regression equation, so what went into the matching was actually everything on the right-hand side without the C variable, so without the conflict variable. So we did include country fixed effects, time fixed effects, and the quadratic PC years, which are pre-conflict durations. So in that sense, we did account for time in as many ways as we could without actually trying to overfit the model and trying to create noise rather than amplify the signal. So if that answers the question.
Yeah.
I think so. So we'll move on to the next question. The last one for the section from Liz Wilson. Was there an initial attempt to include countries with civil or intrastate conflict in this research?
Well, civil, I mean, interstate within, Liz, you mean that within countries, that's the main focus of the analysis. So intrastate across countries, no, we didn't include, and we thought that was, I mean, probably the conditions for that would be there are theoretical argument of inequality driving that is a little weaker, so we didn't.
Okay. Thank you for that. So let's move on to the second presentation or second section on the results and discussion, and we'll then have another opportunity for people to ask questions.
All right. Thanks, Zach. Okay, so let me dive into the findings. So what did we find? So we start out very simple in the beginning. The first question we answer is, does conflict at all have any effect on these outcomes of interest that we mentioned earlier? So years of schooling, the gender parity index, national inequality, ethnic inequality, and the wealth inequality of education. And you can see from this graph, although these effects might seem a little small, they're not that small because these are percentage point changes on the overall mean outcome. So for instance, to put things into perspective, and in terms of the wealth decile Gini, you'll see that the effect of conflict on the wealth Gini was 1.1 points, or 0.011. But that is relative to a mean of 0.23, which means that this is a 5% increase in inequality as a result of conflict. Similarly goes for when we go down to the ethnic or religious Gini, we see that there's almost no effect and it's not statistically significant. So this one is a no-go here. But when we look at inequality at the national level, we see this effect of 0.007, which is a 0.7 point increase in inequality at the national level, relative to the mean of the sample, which is about 0.42. This means that inequality at the national level actually increased by about 2% on average as a result of conflict or interstate conflict. The next set of results, we look at the gender parity index, and here we see that the actual GPI goes down by 3.3 points, but relative to the mean GPI of conflict countries, that's about 76 points, which means that the GPI actually decreased by almost 5%. That means that the educational attainment of girls relative to the educational attainment of boys was actually lower by 5% as a result of conflict. So we can see in this case, the evidence is showing that conflict actually worsens inequality between groups and also at the national level to varying levels of magnitude. The final row we look at here, we have the log mean years of schooling, which means that this effect is basically saying that conflict lowered mean attainment by almost 0.6%. That's less than 1%, which is in this case is not very significant and not very prominent. So this brought us to our next question: where is the effect most prominent? Where is it bigger? And so we split up we slice up the data a little bit more, and now we look at whether or not there are differences in terms of the nature of the conflict. So does ethnic conflict have a bigger effect than non-ethnic conflict? And here we see some overwhelming evidence. Actually, ethnic conflict is the most prominent in terms of its effect or negative effect on these educational outcomes. So the very top row, you'll see that the inequality between wealth groups actually increases by 2.2 points as a result of conflict, and that's almost a 9.6% increase. So that's almost a 10% increase in the educational inequality between wealth groups as a result of ethnic conflict. Whereas we look at non-ethnic conflict, that effect is almost zero. And when we look at ethnic or religious inequality of education, we'll see that ethnic conflict had no effect, and non-ethnic conflict had a minor effect of about 7%. This is a 0.9 percentage point increase relative to a mean of 0.12, which means that it actually did increase ethnic inequality quite a bit, but in terms of absolute value or absolute levels, it's still a very small enacted change. At the national level, we see that ethnic conflict actually increased national inequality by 1.2 points, and that translates to about a 3% increase. So again, not that big at the national scale, but still enough to actually make a dent on average in terms of inequality between individuals. The bigger effect here we will see is on gender parity, and you'll see that ethnic conflict actually lowered the gender parity index by almost 5.3 points, which translates to about a 7% decrease in the parity in educational attainment between the genders. And so girls are getting hit much worse than boys are when their country is observing conflict. And in terms of overall attainment, we see that actually ethnic conflict actually lowers mean years of schooling by 2.2%. So that's still a non-negligible effect, even though it's not statistically significant. So we keep exploring some more to answer some of these research questions that we asked initially. So do conflicts have differential effects depending on the intensity of the conflict? And so here we interact the type of conflict and whether or not it's a major or a minor conflict. And again, the largest effects come from ethnic conflicts that are minor in their intensity, or that are between 25 and 1,000 deaths. So in the first row, you'll see that minor ethnic conflicts actually increase the inequality between wealth groups by about almost 11%. It also increases the inequality at the national level by 2 to 3%, depending on whether it's minor or major. And then in terms of gender parity, you'll see that it actually lowers it by almost 8.3%, or in this case, 6.3 points on the gender parity index. And in terms of its effect on years of schooling, you'll see that it has the largest effect. Ethnic minor conflict had the largest effect, and they lowered attainment by almost 3%. The next set of results have to do with how does the effect of ethnic conflict change over time. So if conflict keeps going on for more than 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 16 plus years, what is it doing to the inequality between these groups? And so you'll see here we look at the effect on wealth inequality of education, and you'll see that in the beginning it has no effect in the first 5 years, but then 6 to 10 years later it actually increases by almost 10%, and then it increases up to 16%, and then finally it increases all the way up to 23%. So if a conflict goes on for more than 16 years, we would expect that the inequality between wealth groups in a certain country experiencing ethnic conflict or protracted ethnic conflict goes up by 23%. So that is, as you can tell, is a huge dent into the inequality distribution of education. The trends don't necessarily match up in terms of talking about ethnic or religious group inequality, but they do match up when we talk about inequality at the national level. So you'll see there's a nice step function of inequality at the national level going up by 2 to 3% in the first 10 years, and then it increases up to 5% if the ethnic conflict goes on for longer than 16 years. And then when we look at the gender parity index, we see that this actually there's actually no effect again, almost no effect in the first 5 years. However, 6 to 10 years later, the parity between the genders actually increases by almost 10%, and then increases up to 13 and 14% in 11 plus years of ethnic conflict. So that means, again, the conclusion is fairly straightforward in that the longer a conflict goes, especially if it's ethnic in nature, the worse the inequality will get between the different groups. And in the final row, we look at mean years of schooling. We see that the majority of the effect is actually coming from ethnic conflicts that last longer than 16 years, where attainment is actually lower by almost 18%. So that is a huge dent in terms of the average years of schooling for a particular country as a result of conflict. On the next slide, I will go through a visualization of how this effect goes over time and how it ends. And so basically, if you look at any of the three panels where we look at educational Gini, vertical, wealth decile, or ethnic or religious, you'll notice that prior to conflict are the light blue dots. See, it's a straight line because we're controlling for the trend. And then once conflict hits, you'll see that the inequality begins to rise, and it keeps rising until the end of conflict. And once conflict ends, it will start to decline, but potentially it could never recover its baseline levels of inequality. And this seems to be true across all of our measurements of inequality. Finally, we look at the results in terms of the effects of ethnic and non-ethnic conflicts, this aggregated by a country's level of fragility. And so you'll see here P greater than 0.46 denotes that a country with a given set of characteristics was more than 46% likely to experience conflict, and that's how we divide our data, and that's what we define as high fragility versus low fragility. And you'll see all of the effect is coming from the high fragility countries, where the effect on the wealth Gini is about 3.8 points, which is almost a 16.5% increase in inequality. And at the national level, that's almost a 2.5% increase in inequality. And then in terms of the gender parity, that's almost a 10.5% increase in inequality between girls and boys. And then in terms of attainment, you see that it actually lowers years of schooling by almost 7.5%. So finally, to sort of wrap up really quickly, the key takeaways of our study is that we find that conflict does worsen inequality in education, both between groups and between individuals. And this is definitely true for countries that have experienced conflict. So we've quantified how big of an effect conflict has had on the countries that experienced it. But again, when we disaggregate, we look at the ethnic conflicts seem to have the most pronounced effects compared to non-ethnic conflicts. And obviously, the longer the conflict goes, the worse the level of inequality will become. And even though after a conflict ends, we do see some minor improvement in inequality, but it may never return to its pre-conflict levels. So it means that conflict is actually creating a permanent dent in the inequality of education between groups and between individuals. And then finally, this is to summarize, ethnic conflicts among fragile states are most detrimental to education, which means that if a country is considered fragile according to our definition, then it is most likely to have the biggest effect on its educational outcomes. And I think Karina can talk a little bit more about the study in general and about our team.
I think I'm just going to pass, and you guys, you see the slide and you see the link to where you can find the studies. But in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to pass to Shai and Annie at this point.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation, Wael and Karina. I don't see any questions. We do have a couple minutes for questions. Perhaps what we'll do is I'll let Annie talk about the initiative, and in the meantime, if people want to formulate your questions, make sure you type those on the chat box, and we'll have those answered at the end. So Annie, do you want to talk about the initiative?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. If you want to switch to the next slide. So out of this wonderful work that was commissioned by UNICEF, we have developed an education equity research initiative, which is really a partnership between a number of organizations, primarily between FHI 360 and Save the Children. Do I have control over the slides? Or can someone else flip to the next slide? Thank you. I can go ahead. So the Education Equity Research Initiative is a collaborative partnership led by FHI 360, Save the Children, UNICEF, ECCN, World Vision, and other partners. And there's a number of different initiatives that are being undertaken by the group. We're going to be working on, or we are working on, developing metrics looking at the magnitude and effects of education inequality on programming and policy. We're really trying to, as a group, unpack the root causes of inequality in outcomes, and we're looking at building evidence on closing gaps and improving equity through education. Within the larger group, there's 4 different work streams, and those look at measurement and metrics in general is the first work stream. The second one looks at learning and retention, more specifically. The third one is the one that we're talking about today, which is looking at conflict and fragility specifically, and contexts where in equity issues in those contexts. And then the fourth one looks specifically at financing issues. So there we go. Now I see the slide. So the key objective of the Conflict and Fragility Working Group, which is the group that co-sponsored this presentation, is to explore the connections between educational inequality and conflict and fragility on the one hand, and the potential of educational equity for strengthening peace and stability on the other hand. And that really is explored through some framing questions, if you can switch to the next slide. And the framing questions are, what dimensions of education inequity are particularly relevant in areas of conflict and fragility? What are the structural and institutional drivers of inequity within education systems in these environments, and what are the effective approaches for reducing them? What approaches and strategies are effective for identifying disadvantaged groups in these kinds of environments and strengthening their outcomes educationally? And then finally, as this group got going with a number of different members, we started looking also at what are the kind of unique challenges to gathering and using data-related inequity in these kinds of fragile and conflict-affected contexts, and how can we surmount these challenges? So looking really methodologically at how we do that. So those are the framing questions that we're looking at. We have several projects that we're working on at the moment. We have a landscape review of research on equity and education in areas of conflict and fragility that's ongoing at this moment. We're doing a context analysis going forward, and M&E tools will be developing, and then providing also research guidance, looking at how to do better monitoring, evaluation, and research in some of these really challenging contexts. So if you're interested in learning more, we'd be very happy to have your participation. We meet once a month on the phone and doing work all the time. So we'd love your support. You can contact me. My email is asmiley@fhi360.org. You could also contact Shai at ECCN. We are co-leading this working group, and Shai's email is on screen. So now that we have about 3 minutes left, so I think I'll turn it back to Shai.
Sure, thank you. We have just a couple more minutes for, I think we'll squeeze in one question or combined questions, which we received around gender. And Well and Karina, perhaps you can discuss more what you found to be the differences between the gender, how inequality affects gender specifically, why are girls affected more in conflict, by conflict in terms of educational inequality. Not only just clarify your results, but also share with us some of your thoughts about why do you think that might be so, especially to address one of the questions, given that the assumption is that boys are more intimately involved in conflict, that they're the ones doing the fighting and the dying. Can you tell us more about why you think girls are being affected more?
Sure. So from our literature review, we found that there actually is a sizable literature that shows that during times of civil war, women or poor women in particular tend to suffer more during times of conflict, and basically exacerbating these pre-existing gaps that are already there. I don't have exact examples in my head, but from what I do remember, there are cases where young women or young girls tend to become more valuable during times of war, in terms of becoming better matches for marriage, even though at a young age, or becoming more useful in terms of their sort of their support to conflict, and that they do actually contribute, even though not necessarily in a military sense. So there are there. Yeah.
Sorry, jumping in here. I think that, so we're not able to look at the in depth at the why, and I mean this question has been asked before. Is it sort of counterintuitive that shouldn't we expect that boys have lower levels of educational attainment? And I mean if you think about how we structured the outcome, that kind of takes us a few years after the conflict onset. So it's not just at the time of the incident it's over time, and over time it seems that girls are more likely to not attain, to not progress to the level that allows them, that they would have otherwise if the conflict hadn't been there, for the reasons that the methodology of the study doesn't allow us to look into. It would probably require an additional, for a future research agenda. But yeah, so I mean, I think that you have to be thinking that it's not during the conflict itself; it's after, and it's years after it's ended.
Great, thank you. So it is 10 o'clock, so we've arrived at the end of our presentation. Thank you, Karina and Wael, for your response to that question, but also for your presentation. It was a fascinating work that you've done, so thank you for sharing that with all of us. I just want to reiterate, there are plenty of ways to continue this conversation and for all of you to become engaged, both through ECCN. Go to our website and sign up to become a member and to receive our newsletter. Also, contact us if you're interested in the equity initiative that Annie spoke about. You can email Annie, me, or Karina as well. And finally, yeah, go ahead, Karina.
Sorry, a quick plug for the event. We have, as the Education Equity Research Initiative, we're having an event on September 19th. Those of you who can be in New York, you're invited, and we hope to see you there, and hope to continue conversations that we started today.
And just one quick comment, where there's some questions that weren't answered, we are going to post those questions and the answers on the events page for this webcast. If you have additional questions, do email us, and again, we will post those and get those answers for you as a way to continue the conversation. So again, thank you to our presenters, and thank you to everyone who participated, who listened and shared your questions with us. And we'll hope to have you all again in our future events. Thank you very much.